Good evening, and welcome to another evening of our Wednesday night Bible lesson. Hey, did you enjoy the snow last week? I know I did. It was pure relaxation. No work, no school for an entire week. Absolutely amazing. hmm And tonight's lesson is going to be absolutely amazing. We're going to read from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19. And what I love about these verses is that it takes us to the end game, the result, the finish line of the life of faith in an individual. It will encourage us to see the kind of faith that is produced when God has his way with a person over the long haul. We'll see the kind of faith that is produced when a person is simply willing to believe and trust God no matter what the circumstances are. Oh, this is going to be a good one. I'm so excited. So, as you can remember, a couple of weeks ago, Sister Shonda talked to you about a great man of faith. Do you remember his name? That's right, Abraham. She talked to you about how Abraham's faith and obedience in God led him to the promised land. So, we're going to learn more about Abraham and how Abraham had faith in God when God asked him to offer his son Isaac. Hmm. Before I read the verses, I want you to do something for me. Think about when you're in school and you hear that most dreaded word from your teacher. Test. That's right. It's time to take a test or exam. How does it make you feel? Are you nervous? Are you scared? I bet you cringe a bit, don't you? Because you don't want to take a test. Who wants to take a test? Especially when you feel like you're not ready. I know when I was in school, I didn't want to take a test either. So I know how you feel. But think about that word test as I read these verses. I'll be reading from the New Message Version. Hebrews chapter 11, 17 through 19. By faith, Abraham, at the time of testing, offered Isaac back to God. Acting in faith, he was as ready to return the promised son, his only son, as he had been to receive him. And this after he had already been told, "Your descendants shall come from Isaac." Abraham figured that if God wanted to, he could raise the dead. In a sense, that's what happened when he received Isaac back alive from the altar. So in these verses, the Hebrew writer actually gives a summary of what took place in Genesis 22, where the story unfolds in detail. Well, let me give you a little background information. God has revealed himself many times through Abraham's successes and his failures, through Abraham's faith and his fears. So Abraham knew of God's character. Now, when Abraham was 75 years old, God promised him a son. That's right, at 75 years old. Keep in mind that God's promises does not have a timetable connected to it. God promises tells us what he's going to do, not when he's going to do it. Okay? So 25 years later, Abraham has his promised son. So let's do the math here. Now, Abraham was 75 years old when God made him that promise. 25 years later, Isaac was born. So how old was Abraham when Isaac was born? That's right. He was 100 years old. So think about this. Abraham waited 25 years for a son, and he finally got a son. Put yourself in Abraham's shoes. Think of something that you wanted for a long, 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 long time, and you finally get it. Boy, oh boy, how does it make you feel? Are you excited? Are you happy? Are you joyous? Of course you are. Woo. Then all of a sudden, out of the blue, you got to give it up. hmm This is what Abraham, his situation was. Boy, I told you this is going to be a good one. This is going to be a good one. Okay, so now let's take a closer look at these verses. So let's look back at verse 17. By faith, Abraham, at the time of testing, offered his son Isaac. So the first point we get from this is God will test our faith. Mhm. He will allow us to go through trials and tribulations. He will allow us to face hardships day in and day out. It can be hard to understand why a good and perfect God allow us to go through trying situations that we think we can't handle. But keep in mind, God never tests us beyond what we can bear. So why does God test us? That's a good question. God tests us so that we may come to know how trustworthy and faithful He is during those hard times. He wants to build up and strengthen our faith. He wants us to grow. So it's a process. And Abraham, the great man of faith, it wasn't as if he started out strong in faith and never faltered. He has his ups and downs, just like we do. But God kept testing him, just like God keeps testing us. Because God's test is for our good. Let's look at point 2. Respond to test with obedience. So remember when I said earlier that God revealed himself many times to Abraham? So Abraham didn't just land on this exceptional faith. His faith was built up and he was still being tested. But this one right here was no pop quiz. It was the final exam. It was the big one. He was asked to offer his son Isaac, his beloved son, his promised son, the son he waited 25 years for. And without hesitation, he obeyed. Yep. And the way we can apply this example is that when God commands us to do something difficult, we should obey. It could be just something simple as forgiving those who talk about you at school or is mean to you. Now, I know that could be hard, but we have to forgive those. So let's look at verse 18. In verse 18, we see that God had already told Abraham that his descendants would come from Isaac. So point 3 is focus on God's promises. Abraham's faith did not waver because he trusted the promise that God had made to him wouldn't be broken. Sometimes you want to question, how is God going to do this? How is God going to do that? But that's not for us to question. That's not for us to try to figure out. We just have to keep in mind God's promises and trust that God would do what he says he's going to do. So let's take a quick look at 19. Abraham figured that if God wanted to, he could raise the dead. Point 4. Don't forget what God did in the quizzes. Because of Abraham's faith and obedience, God came through on his promises. So he knew that Isaac would be just fine if he offered Isaac to God, because God promised him descendants and they had to come from Isaac. So next time you're faced with a difficult situation that seems hard to bear, look at your past experiences and see how God brought you through. The last point I want to make from these verses is allow faith to take you out your comfort zone. Yes, that's a big one to do. Abraham was asked to do the unthinkable, but his faith stayed strong. And to demonstrate faith, there will be times when we're going to have to step out of our comfort zone and do what's asked of us to do. It's not going to be easy, but that's why it's a process. Oh, this is a great lesson, great lesson. So examples of Abraham's faith that we can learn from this is to trust and obey God without protest or hesitation. So the next time you're tested, don't think of it as a bad thing. Remember the process. God is building your faith. God is taking you to a new grade level. God is taking you to a higher experience with Him. Woo, that's good. So I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. Please share this lesson with your friends, especially if you see that they're feeling discouraged, and remind them of the test.